So for our gouache tutorial, you will need a couple of jugs of clean water, your brushes, some kitchen paper, a palette. I'm using a porcelain plate, but you have a palette in your boxes, a selection of colors from your box, and I'm using cartridge paper, but I will also show you on the watercolor paper, the thicker one, how the paint reacts. So what is gouache? Gouache is a water-based paint. It's a bit like watercolor, but it has more pigments, and it's more dense, and you can layer it or dilute it, which you will really experiment in our 4 projects. The main thing you need to know is when you start with gouache, you don't need to add too much water, unlike watercolor, because it is much more opaque, and that is the beauty of gouache. So in this warm-up, I'm going to show you several techniques which will be mainly to learn how to dilute the colors on the palette, or you can even do it on the paper, how to do a gradient mix on your paper, how to mix colors, overlap, and just create some effects which we'll use particularly in the cloud in the daffodil project. So I'm going to start here with, I'll show you with the paint on the paper. And we're going to do a little exercise which shows you how to dilute the paint. So on my cartridge paper, I've applied directly the gouache paint, and I'm dipping my brush in a tiny bit of water. And I'm just going to apply it on the paper. So I'm using the flat brush for this. And you can see it's got a really dense pigmentation. And I will do the same on the watercolor paper, just sort of as a comparison for you, but don't waste your watercolor paper for this particular exercise. Just use your cartridge paper. So I'm doing my first square. We're going to work downwards. My first square is opaque, the most opaque I can find. Now deep green is actually quite a translucent color in our mix, so I will demonstrate it with a different color afterwards. So we've got our first square, which is the most opaque, and I'm going to dip my brush in a little bit of water, and we're going to do a second square which is going to be a little bit more diluted, and we're going to go sort of downwards just to demonstrate the paint, how the paint sits on the paper. So and just to show you that gouache is able to respond like watercolor on the paper, we're going to paint, put a bit too much there. We're going to paint a wet square, just a blank wet square on the bottom here. So if you just remove the paint from your brush, make sure it's clean. There you are. Just grab some clean water and just paint in a wet square at the bottom here of your column, and we're going to drop in some gouache paint on the wet square, and that's the same technique as wet on wet. So we'll just grab some diluted paint and sort of, you see the paint react with the water. I'm going to demonstrate now with a different color, which is purple, just because the opacity is different, and obviously it depends on the color you're choosing. So I'm going to grab some purple, and you can see already it's more dense, more opaque than the green. Now often with gouache, when the paint dries, it changes ever so slightly color. So darker colors tend to dry lighter, and lighter colors tend to dry darker. So that's something to bear in mind, particularly when you do your mix on your palette, just to think about how it will dry. So we'll just add a bit of water now to do our diluted versions. Gouache also has a nice sort of matte velvety finish, which is very nice to use, particularly for sort of poster, naive sort of art, and it dries quickly, which is quite nice because it allows you to work with it, work over it, overlap your colours and add details on top of your underneath layer. So that's our first sort of warm-up. We'll let this dry and we're going to move to a gradient mix, which is where we mix two colors. We work from two directions towards the middle, and the colors meet in the middle, and we do a wash in that way. So we're going to use, for that, we're going to use yellow and blue. So I'm going to start with the yellow. I've changed brush because I quite like to work with my pointed brush, round pointed brush. I don't put too much water on the brush, and I'm just working with the paint, and I'm going to start on this one. So just, if you start with a thicker layer, with an opaque layer, and then gradually add some water to it. Sort of to get a gradient wash. I've got a lot of paint on my brush, and so you just slowly do a gradient wash like this, and then clean your brush, make sure there's no paint left on it, and we're going to grab some blue, and we're going to start from the other end, and we're going to slowly blend into our yellow, and doing a gradient wash and blend the colors in the middle. So I'll do this on the cartridge paper now. So you can see on the watercolor paper, the paint mixes better, obviously, because it absorbs more water, whereas the cartridge paper is perhaps not quite as receptive to the water-based, the amount of water you put in. So that's just to bear in mind that cartridge paper is really just for practice for you in your packs. It's not for doing the project, because the paint will not react in the same way as it does on watercolor paper. Well, I'll do a different mix now, and we'll mix on the palette. So I'm going to use some magenta red. So just changing your water regularly is important as well. So you keep working. You have a clean water to clean your brushes. So I'm now going to use. I'm going to do a red and blue mix. So I'm going to mix on the palette, grab a bit of red and a bit of blue, like this. So there we are, we have our three colors, and we're going to use this for our mix, to do our gradient mix on the paper now. So we'll start with the red. Here we go. And I'm going to slowly add some of the purple mix, and then slowly move into the blue. So that's our gradient mix that we mixed on the palette, and this is the one we mixed on paper. So for this next exercise, we'll do a mixing of red and white. And so just to show you how one color we can obtain different shades of that particular color. And when you add white, it makes it more opaque. So it's quite an interesting sort of finish. So we'll just start with a simple square of pure scarlet red. Right, there we are. And I'll do the same on the watercolor paper. Again, I put the minimum amount of water is just to wet the brush. The paint should glide on the paper really nicely. So there we are, we've got our first square. And then I'm going to add slowly some white to my red. So when you feel that your brush is not gliding on the paper anymore, then add just a tiny bit of water. You don't want it to catch on the paper. You want it to be a really smooth sort of brush stroke. Quick change of the water and of my kitchen paper, just because it's nice to have some fresh water to work with. And so I'm going to use the green, and I'm going to use a lighter green this time, sort of a more vivid color. And of a darker blue. Right, so I'll start with the blue, just with my flat brush. Again, not too much water. Dip it in your paint, and you want it to be really sort of velvety and smooth on your palette. And we're just going to do a flat wash here. So I'm going to let this dry now, and whilst this is drying, I'm going to show you the way you can reactivate the paint on your paper. So for example, if you weren't happy, if you've made a mistake, if you thought that somewhere your layer was too thick, you can just dip your brush in water and sort of reactivate. I'll show you on here. You can reactivate the paint. And you know, if you're like me and sometimes you like to correct things or add or remove sort of areas, then you can do that with gouache. It's really handy. And then you could let this dry and paint over it with a different color. So the last thing I'm going to show you now is how to layer the paint over a dry area, which I've laid on my palette here, and just sort of show you how you can apply a different layer over the bottom layer without disturbing it. The way to do this is if you just go over it once. So I'll just do it like this. Just do some stripes like so. If you go over it once, it's fine. You can create a nice opaque layer over it. If you wanted to work with the underneath color, then as soon as you add a bit more water to your paint and your brush, you will start reactivate the color underneath it. So for example, here we could sort of paint our cloud, and as you add a little bit of water, it starts to reactivate, and you can see the blue is blending in now with the white. And I haven't added blue to my brush, I've just used the color that was underneath here. So this is really interesting when you want to work to create sort of blending effects and smooth edges. So you can just add a bit of water and that will just mix in with your layer. For the second part here, I'm just going to show you how to use a layer over layer without necessarily blending with the underneath layer. So for this, we're just going to work more quickly. So you get a more sort of an embossed sort of highlighted effect. Paint isn't flat on your surface. So I'll just demonstrate here again. So these are just a few techniques that you can apply in our projects, and it's just sort of worth knowing for other projects you might complete on your own. So points to note is that you can dilute your paint easily by just adding water, that you can blend it on paper or you can blend it on your palette, that you can mix colors and obtain different shades of same opacity, or you can dilute it. There's the other really nice thing that we need to remember with gouache is that once it dries, you can reactivate it on your palette and you know, and reuse it on your paper. So I'm just reactivating some green here. You can do that, and you can also reactivate it directly on your paper like so. And so it allows you to sort of play with it, and you know, you can create softer edges if you wanted to. It's really a quite forgiving medium. So just remember that when it dries, the colors change slightly, so it can be either a little bit lighter if it's a dark color, or it's a little bit darker if it's a pale color. And also that when you overlap, when you layer colors like so, you have to work quite quickly, because the underneath layer might start to be reactivated with the water. So I hope you found these useful, and you can use those for your own projects, or for completing the Art Class in a Box projects we have on our website. And yes, do let us know how you get on, and I'm looking forward to seeing you for our Art Class in a Box projects.